I was interested in Dale's presentation on heretics, because that's really what this one is about too. I've called it here on my own, heretical heroes or orthodox heretics, because that's the issue for me. When I grew up in the Church of God, and I'm one of the few, I think, here, my wife is another, who have always been in the Church of God. So this, you all is fairly new to this in some ways. Some of you are newer than others, but this is just what I always expected. It wasn't until I...
Sorry, excuse me. Need a mic. Another one.
Another mic, okay. Ooh, that one's loud.
That's good.
Now I have a kind of a quiet voice anyway.
Okay, only with you.
Another one, okay.
Okay, can you start over?
I could, yes, but I won't. So there. Well, my special area of emphasis when I was at the Bible college became history, and by extension, of course, church history. And then as it developed, I realized that church history also includes, and has to include, theology. So church history and theology, and as I went into it more deeply, it became the Radical Reformation, which is what I'm going to be speaking particularly about today. And we'll be talking about those radicals. Now, it became obvious to me that what I considered to be orthodox biblical views were not considered orthodox by orthodoxy. You hear that? What I considered to be orthodox was considered heretical, and what I was told is heretical by orthodoxy was not at all biblical, in my opinion. So, while in attendance at seminary, in fact, I have to tell this story. We were in one of our seminary classes. I don't know, there's 20 of us or so, and the professor, Phil Anderson, Dr. Phil Anderson, became a good friend. But he was telling me in the seminar we were debating a question, and one of the other students took a position that was against what the other students took. Well, I said, I agree with you. And immediately he fired back, oh no, said the heretic. And so now they were very kind about it, but that was how they saw me, because they understood what I thought. Now, in fact, I went to dinner one night at his house, at Dr. Anderson's house. His doctorate was from Oxford, so he certainly had an impeccable doctorate. And while in conversation then, I posed this question to him. I said, Phil, how do you find justification in the Bible for the Trinity? How do you find it in the Bible? And he said to me, and these words just really sank into my psyche. He said, biblical scholarship is on your side, pointing to me. But then he went on, but the councils helped us to understand what the Bible was trying to say. Well, if God couldn't get it right, I doubt the councils could. That was the way I came back, and he still passed me. Now, it's impossible to go much further in a discussion, as was suggested earlier, when the foundation isn't based on the Bible, but on what others have said about the Bible. So if we can't go back to the Bible and talk about what the Bible says, arguing, in a good sense, about the Bible itself, it becomes very nebulous as to whether or not we can achieve anything if you are appealing to the councils and I'm appealing to the Bible, but you don't accept the Bible and I don't accept the councils. We have very little common ground there to work with. But my contention is, as we go through church history, we're going to identify people who were searchers for truth. They didn't arrive where I would be comfortable having them arrive, but I think that we should honor them, some of them, as searchers for truth. And when I come to the end of this, I may ask the question, will ask the question, do we feel we have arrived and don't have to search anymore? Or is there yet truth that we would want to discover? In the first several hundred years after the time of Christ, the church struggled with outside influence from Greek philosophers and many Jewish Gentile cultural differences. At every turn, there were opinions profoundly at odds with the generally accepted doctrines being taught and upheld by Paul and the apostles. Some of them had heard directly from Jesus. They passed that along. Once these formerly accepted doctrines of orthodox, understand I'm using that, orthodox, which was biblical, they drifted to embrace some of these opinions, then heresy was upon us. Paul warned about heresies and preaching a different gospel, even as early as Galatians. He said, I am amazed that you are so quickly deserting him who called you by the grace of Christ for a different gospel, which is really not another. For there are some who are disturbing you and want to distort the gospel of Christ. But even if we, or an angel from heaven, should preach to you a gospel contrary to what we have preached to you, he is to be accursed. As we said before, so I say again now, if any man is preaching to you a gospel contrary to what you received, he is to be accursed. For as I now am I now seeking the favor of men or of God? Jude then also, you remember, which has become kind of a thematic verse for us, said, Beloved, while I was making every effort to write to you about our common salvation, I felt the necessity to write to you, appealing for you to contend earnestly for the faith which was once for all handed down to the saints. For certain persons have crept in unnoticed, those who were long before marked out for this condemnation, ungodly persons who turn the grace of our God into licentiousness and deny our only Maker and Lord Jesus Christ. Now, those verses seem to me to speak to this issue. Is there, in fact, somewhere a cutoff point, or is there not a cutoff point? And I raised that with Dale this morning in that question. Could we say there is anything essential? I understand the question saying, or the response that said, well, probably not. You can be a Trinitarian, I think, and still be in a saved, however you take that word, saved condition. But can you be a Trinitarian and believe in the God of the Bible and his Son, Jesus Christ? See, it seems to me that Jude, and for that matter Paul, thinks that there is one gospel. Now, I am not the one who is going to determine whether or not someone is a Christian. But I certainly would be, I think, well advised to say, I don't believe your understanding of Bible teaching on this matter is correct. It's up to God to make that final decision, or through his Son, but it's not up to me. But I think, my opinion is, you're incorrect. And it seemed to all happen so quickly. Truth that we believe to be biblical teaching, or orthodoxy, as we understand orthodoxy, soon became heresy, and New Testament heresy was instituted as the new orthodoxy. Let's go to the first century, the first section from that first century up to about AD 325. The New Testament churches organized to stay alive, and over the next several hundred years, bishops in the important cities at least of Rome in Italy, Alexandria in Egypt, and Constantinople in Turkey, emerged as leaders of groups of churches. The religious fervor in the church that raged for more than 100 years, from AD 313 at least, to AD 451 or so, you pronounced it Chalcedon, or I pronounced it Chalcedon. It was, Dale, what did you say,
Chalcedon.
Chalcedon, okay. I'd never heard that pronunciation, just curiosity.
We want to know who's right.
What's that? Well, I don't know that one is a doctrinal issue, a salvation issue. We'll have to have a debate on that. Dustin, you want to do debates? We'll have a debate on the correct pronunciation. The new Roman emperor, let's see, where did I stop? The relationship, Jesus to God, was he the same flesh or similar flesh? It erupted between Bishop Alexander and Arius first, and then Athanasius jumped into the equation, and soon, of course, they were banishing one another. Some have suggested the banishment went back and forth as many as 7 times. Now, I've never been able to fully document that, but it was more than once and twice and 3 times anyway. Now, the new Roman emperor, Constantine, stepped in with the First Council of Nicaea in AD 325 to primarily stop the divisiveness of the church and unite the empire rather than to research Scripture to try to come up with a correct understanding of truth. Everyone at the council had to sign the resulting Nicene Creed, which of course wasn't complete until Chalcedon or Chalcedon. Or is there another one? Can we come up with a third one? We should have a trinity, shouldn't we?
Chalcedon.
Chalcedon. Okay. All right. Everyone at the council had to sign the resulting Nicene Creed. Constantine felt he was aided, he said, by the divine power of God and had come to bring peace and prosperity to all lands. Well, there were always some who said, this is ridiculous. But many of them, most of them, signed because of a power struggle. And we're going to see this power struggle being so instrumental in the development of doctrine. Isn't that interesting? Now, the government was endorsing one theological position, the Trinity, and those who disagreed found themselves not only facing banishment from churches, but also even from the empire, and potentially facing even death. And by the way, Sean, I really appreciated, and I make this note here, Sean Finnegan had 3 articles that he allowed us to republish in the E-Herald of the Coming Kingdom, which, by the way, is free to you. It comes out monthly, and it's posted online, so it isn't something you have to subscribe to or anything like that. It's just available to you if we have your name and your email address. There's a sign-up sheet that I thought was out at registration, but it's somewhere. Cheryl, is it there with you?
Yes, it'll be on the back table.
All right, on the back table, if you should care to get that. But I just want to commend you, Sean. You've got probably a lot of good stuff in that arena. Anyway, that was the Trinity history, 1, 2, and 3. And the struggle then continued at that point. So our next jump is from AD 325 to then the Reformation in AD 1517. At least that was the trigger of the Reformation. From Nicaea, we of course could say even from 451, with Chalcedon, okay. From Nicaea, the heretical position, or the heretical orthodoxy, became the law of the church. Because Western civilization dominates our own histories, the decline of truth we search to discover came to us from Western Europe and even North Africa in those early years. But by the late 600s, Islam was making inroads on what has become Orthodox Christianity, and it began to disappear from North Africa and even from the Eastern Empire of what we now consider the Roman Empire, which now, of course, was Eastern Orthodoxy. But even Constantinople finally fell, and I thought it was interesting, St. Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom, became a mosque. Islam came across the Straits of Gibraltar, overrunning the Iberian Peninsula until finally stopped in France at Tours by the armies of Charles Martel in AD 732. As early as that, Islam was making it very clear, you either convert or die. You don't have a choice. That's the way it was then, and that's the way it appears to be now, for many of them at least. As a result, Islam was held largely at bay in Europe, though it made its way up through Romania, present-day Romania, evidenced in the city of Rajov. And Cheryl and I had the privilege of traveling there and saw the church where they kept hangings of Islam so that it wouldn't be destroyed, because Islam got that far and then was driven back temporarily there. So now we talk about breaking Catholicism's grip, at least for our history. For the rest of Western Europe, Christendom reigned supreme with the close cooperation of the Church. That term is really called the Magisterial Reformation. Now, we apply that more to not just the Catholic part, but to other parts of the Reformation as well. Because what it is a church involved with the magistrates. So that power, you remember we talked about power, is not just theological, but because it involves social issues, the magistrates were involved. So if you denied the Trinity, you were upsetting the social order. And it was very important, get you back in control, or society would be totally disrupted. Let's see, the Church, the Roman Catholic hierarchy, and the political power of the Holy Roman Empire, which historians note was neither holy, certainly not Roman, nor an empire, except in name. This period, 1517 to essentially 1550, or a little later, which was just over 30-some years, broke the suffocating power of the Orthodox Roman Church. 5 divisions, or I've used 5 fingers of the hand, to represent the breakup of the monolithic Roman Church. Now first, of course, and we should give just due to Martin Luther, in 1517 was challenging this power of the Roman Church by posting on the church doors in Wittenberg 95 theses. These theses were questions. He wasn't intending to break from the Roman Church, but he certainly was concerned over some of the things that they were practicing. In fact, what triggered it finally was when one of the monks came through to collect funds for the building of St. Peter's Cathedral. He had a big chest for his coins to be thrown in as an offering. And it amused me when I first heard this slogan. I thought it was a kind of a cute advertising slogan. It said, "Whenever a coin into my chest doth ring, a soul from purgatory springs." Well, I'm not sure how much springing actually happened. I doubt any. But he was asking for church renewal, especially as to the selling of these indulgences. The second finger, and by the way, this is a definition by George Hunston Williams, who is the preeminent church historian, though now deceased. The second group we can date specifically to January 21st, 1525. I think you need to celebrate that date to think very seriously about what these 3 men that we're going to be talking about there came to. often inappropriately called the Anabaptists in general, the Radical Reformation is really a better term for it, because we find there were also three within these radicals. They were but one of three parts of this section. Centered in Zurich and early associated with Zwingli, they lost Zwingli, who fell away from them in fear of the magistrates. Third, then, and this is Carlos's specialty, is Calvin, and we want to give due credit here. About from 1532 to 1536, he tended to control Geneva to a great extent. It's during that period of time that Servetus, Michael Servetus, was crucified or martyred or burned. And also, of course, from that sprang John Knox of Scotland, and Presbyterianism emerged through his ministry. The fourth group, then, of these five that emerged is called the Anglicans. And that, of course, around 1534, Henry VIII in England. His split with the Roman Catholic Church was not theological. In fact, he was a defender of the Pope. It was, in fact, political and financial, not theological, precipitated by the unwillingness of the reigning Pope at the time to grant him a divorce, or maybe an annulment, from his wife, as she could not present the king with a male heir, at least a male heir that lived. I think she had, Cheryl, what did you tell me, 6 children? She had 6 children. Are you trying to get an annulment? Well, interestingly, the Pope, much as he would have liked to have given him an annulment, couldn't very well do that, because that first wife was related to Charles V, who was the Holy Roman Emperor, and the Holy Roman Emperor is what sustained the Pope in political power. So you see, we keep coming around to this political power where the magistrates are involved with the theology of these various groupings. There was no deviation or recognition of the, well, I'm sorry, I skipped down to the next one. Politically, she was a Spanish princess, this Catherine, and the aunt of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who was the Pope's military support. And then the fifth one is really the Catholic Counter-Reformation, or the Catholic Church continued. We date that from 1545 to 1563. The fifth part of the continuing Roman Church, whose leaders in the Council of Trent, which lasted for those years, almost 20 years, all it did was re-emphasize all of the doctrines of the church as it had been. There was no significant deviation or recognition of the legitimacy at all of the Protestant churches. Now, some of the results of each of these, and I think this helps us to understand what was going on. With Luther, he flirted with Unitarianism, it is said, and may have come to conditionalism in the end. Lutheranism, however, brought him back. And the Lutheran Church always stood for these 4 basics: the Trinity, heaven-going, immortality of the soul, and infant baptism. Now, those 4 are going to emerge as the cornerstone of all of the groupings, except for one part of the Radical Reformation. We're jumping the second part now that we talked about, going to the Reformed movement and the development of Calvinism, as espoused in the monumental work called the Institutes, which were edited and reprinted several times. Now, the Reformed churches and the Scotland Presbyterian churches, in the end, all remained Trinitarian, heaven-going, immortality of the soul, and infant baptism. But strangely enough, Calvin at one time was rumored to be playing with believers' baptism. That's hard to imagine with his stand on infant baptism. Then we go to England, the fourth part. It could have been termed the English Catholic Church, for that is in fact what it really was. For except for the Pope's headship, which was replaced by the Archbishop under the King, doctrinally, the English Church remained Trinitarian, heaven-going, immortality of the soul, and infant baptism. Obviously then, when we come to the Roman Catholic Church, though challenged by the entirety of the Reformation, they finally decided, at the Council of Trent especially it was articulated, that they would remain, as they always had been, Trinitarian, heaven-going, immortality of the soul, and infant baptism. So you see, 4 of the 5 never did deviate from those important doctrinal points. Would we call them essential or not? That's an interesting discussion. I really appreciated that, Dale. Now, in the struggle of the Reformation, there was little in the way of truth discovered and retained. That's why as we read through and study these reformers, we see hints of them wanting to come, but finally backing off because of the magistrates, because it was too dangerous for them to come right out. Now, does that sound at all familiar? We talked to theologians today, perhaps you've talked to pastors, who say, well, I see what you're saying, but, I couldn't possibly preach that. So, going back to number 2, when we talked about the 5 parts of the breakup of the Roman Church, in the arm of the radical Reformation, we find those who were able to and willing to go where the search for truth would lead them. Searching for truth. It was the search for truth that drove them in bits and pieces, losses and gains, and that search was quite disrupted, though, by what happened at Munster. I don't know if you're familiar with Munster, but in 1534, the Anabaptists, as they were called, led by John of Leyden, took power in the Munster city. It was called the Munster Rebellion, and founded a democratic, proto-socialistic state based on the Old Testament, interestingly. They claimed all property, burned all books except the Bible, called it the New Jerusalem, and suggested polygamy would be good. John of Leyden believed he would lead the elect from Munster to capture the entire world and purify it of evil with the sword in preparation for the second coming of Christ and the beginning of the millennium. We say, what do you mean? He's talking about those things? Yes. Of course, he also took one of his wives who dared to challenge him, threw her down to the floor in a public arena, and stomped on her head to kill her because she dared to embarrass him in public. So you can see his motives were not exactly pure. Not really. However, the town was recaptured, the whole of Munster, was recaptured by, or in 1535, by Catholic forces, and the Anabaptists, the leaders, were tortured to death, and their corpses then were exhibited in metal baskets, often confused with cages, but they can still be seen, at least when this research was done, hanging from the tower of St. Lambert's steeple. This event strongly colored the feelings of the magisterium against any compromise with the Protestant movement intent that would disrupt society's norms. Luther would have gone further, but the prince said, wait a minute. Calvin might have gone further, but the magistrate said, whoo, careful. Henry didn't want to go at all. He wanted a different wife to provide him with a male heir. The Roman Church wouldn't move at all, never have, and in my opinion, even with Vatican II and some of those things, their doctrinal stance has not changed. Now, the three primary groups then of these radicals. I said there was the 5 fingers. Now we're down to the 3 that were part of what was so-called Anabaptists, but was in fact better termed the radicals. The first part were those who followed Caspar Schwenkfeld, Schwenkfeld von Ossig, 1589, 1561. They were also called the spiritualizers. They differed with Luther, making communion a spiritual matter, and they practiced adult baptism by sprinkling. Now, the interesting thing is, when we come back to this next part of the radicals, probably their early adult baptisms were by sprinkling. However, we know that it became immersion shortly thereafter, as I'll get to. Now, Caspar Schwenkfeld and the followers, were also opposed to taking the scriptures literally. They were forced from Europe, and some settled in southeastern Pennsylvania, where there were only some 5 churches to this day and some 3,000 members. And really by today they have been somewhat assimilated or incorporated into the United Church of Christ. So their inclusion as part of the Radical Reformation has essentially been lost, as their unique understanding has slipped away as they have become heretically orthodox. The Anabaptists as a whole differed as greatly from Luther as Luther actually did from the Roman Catholics. While giving Luther his due as a reformer, we do well to remember some historic realities. Luther, as well as Calvin and Zwingli, came to harshly oppose those called the Anabaptists. In fact, of the 20 to 40,000 Anabaptists that were martyred in the early decades of that, likely more were massacred by the reforming Protestants than by the Roman Catholics at that time. I think that's amazing. 20 to 40,000 people, because they were like you, and you deserve it too. My opinion. Not really. A couple of you, yeah, but not all of you. The differences between the Anabaptists and the Reformers ran deep. Luther, Calvin, and their associates wanted reformation of the medieval church. The Anabaptists wanted restoration of the New Testament church. And that was the essential difference. The second part then of this part, we called it the second part of the 5 fingers, but it's the second part now of the 3 that are separated. The Anabaptists themselves, a term that for years was used of the entirety of the Radical Reformation, until George Hunston Williams, in his seminal work, The Radical Reformation, reclassified them as but one part, albeit the largest part, of the Radical Reformation. These Christians regarded the Bible as their only rule for faith and life, often equated as Mennonites or Amish or Quakers. There are a lot of them that we would include in this Anabaptist group. In fact, when I was in charge of our national youth camp, it was held over in Indiana. And we started on Sunday afternoon. So I would go over the day before to kind of set our registration up, things like that. And Sunday morning I wanted to go to church. So I walked into a local church there. It appeared to be a kind of a Amish persuasion. Didn't really know it was a different name. But I walked in there not knowing, looking for a place to sit. And I was getting ready to sit down when I also noticed that on this side were all women. On this side were all men. So there were lots of different branches of that section called Anabaptists. They held to, I was going to say Anabaptist Church, they were separated and had no central organization to speak of, and thus as such lack a really precise definition of who they are. But they held to adult or believer's baptism. The Mass, they said, was but a memorial service. They believed in free will, pacifism, secular laws and oaths were not considered legitimate, and 6, congregational support for the pastoral leadership should not come from the government. Now it seems that many of them followed one, though Trinitarianism, adult baptism, but some by 3 immersions forward, and an obscure eschatology, if there was any at all. Finally, we come then to the third representation of the Radical Reformation, which leads to this third representation of them, and identified by Williams, he called them evangelical rationalists. Now, Dale, you didn't like that idea of rationalism, but that did bleed into what they stood for. While the Schwenkfelders and Anabaptists eventually ended up in America, it took the evangelical rationalists much longer to make that shift as we tried to follow them. Now, because I was involved in the Church of God from the very beginning, it was of interest to me to try and find roots. And so that was what I was searching for, trying to go back, trying to make connection. And so they can be traced as originally a part of Zwingli in Zurich, but really they met in Zalakan. Don't you like that? Zwingli in Zurich, outside of Zalakan. Anyway, 3 men that you should remember: Conrad Grabel, George Blaurock, or Bluecoat, and Felix Manz. They can also be claimed by this branch. They were part of a study group with Zwingli, but when Zwingli heard that the magistrates were looking askance at this group, he drew back and withdrew from them, and in fact insisted that, I believe it was Grabel's infant child be baptized. And Grabel said, we can't do that. And they were meeting in prayer, trying to decide what next. And Conrad Grabel and Felix Manz were there, but it was George Kajakob who stepped forward and said, I want to be baptized as an adult believer. As an adult believer. Now, because it was in the house, I tend to think it probably was either sprinkling or pouring at that point. The issue, though, was adult believers. Now, we know it soon became immersion baptism, because that was how it was often treated. When we were going to destroy you, if we were kind, we drowned you. So that if you like baptism so much, this is your third baptism, only you don't come up out of the water. Now, sometimes they burned the adult men at the stake in preference, but usually women were treated gently, tied in a sack, weighted with stones, and thrown in the river to drown. After these men's persecutions, imprisonments, and finally deaths, all 3 of them, or no, I shouldn't say that, 2 of them, within 3 years, their effective witness and preaching left only small, independent groups, as with the other Anabaptists, over much of Central Europe. They couldn't have regular churches because regular churches would have been squashed by the magisterium, the magistrates, in conjunction with the Protestant and the Catholic churches. We can further then connect the evangelical rationalists with Laelius Socini, or often called Socinus, and Fausto Socini, which was his nephew, also known as Socinus or Socinus, as an uncle and nephew. While the uncle was able to escape the Inquisition, though he too was writing the same things, it was clear that if Fausto needed to escape northern Italy, and he fled, first to Bohemia and then to Poland, where he came in contact with those known as the Polish Brethren. They had already come to a somewhat Unitarian understanding of God, which has been codified in what is known as the Rakovian Catechism, which is available to you. Catechism or confession. It is likely that some of the text of the Catechism had been prepared by this Italian exile, Fausto Socini, who had settled among the Polish Brethren in 1579 without ever formally joining the group. He never was allowed to be considered one of the Polish Brethren. And he died the year before that the Rakovian Catechism was actually finished in draft form and printed. Despite the lack of any official status in the church, Socini had been very influential in bringing the Polish church round to a Christology which closely resembled what he had learned from his uncle Laelius Socinus, who was an let's see, I apologize, but I'm losing my dexterity too. Fausto then refused baptism, and for that reason, as he refused adult baptism, and so he was not allowed to become part of the Polish Brethren because they insisted that you had to be baptized as a believer, as an adult. But he said, I am a believer, then be baptized. No, I don't need to be. Well, it's your choice. But see, that was something that they insisted on. There were essentials even for them. Now, that's the hard thing, to know what in fact did Jude mean when he said that you contend for the faith once delivered. What did Paul mean? He said, if I or an angel from heaven preach something different, and so our search goes on. These all, and I honor them all, I recognize their tremendous courage. Unfortunately, they drew back. Unfortunately. They were getting close to discovering things that we hold. But I've also seen even some who have attended this conference over the years who have drawn back. And so that truth once delivered, and which must be contended for, continues as our ongoing task, one which calls us to help in the discovery and the struggle, and I believe it is a struggle, continues, for there are areas where we too do not have a good understanding of certain doctrinal areas. Thank you. On Sunday morning, just a comment, I'm going to be continuing some of this, but it's more in the form of a sermon than in just the form of a historical report.
Thank you, Kent. Good to hear you teaching again after these number of years that we've not been together. We were in the college for many years. Well, started in 1982 together. And this refreshes me with the thought that we are part of a very great tradition, and we should not take that lightly, and we should live up to the high standards of our forefathers. Do we have some comments, questions to Kent on what he said? We have a few minutes before we start our break and then faith stories, which tend to be very fascinating, these meetings. He silenced you all. No objections.
That's good, because I'm a little scared of some of these people out
They're,
here.
they're terrifying lot. You watch, you look at them from up here. Very frightening.
So just about Menno Simons and how did the whole, the heavenly flesh theory was actually believed by Menno, from what I understand?
I don't know the theology of that well, so I won't answer that. No.
Anthony, you know it well? Or do you know the history of Menno?
Not in that detail. I couldn't give you an authority.
Did he profess to be Trinitarian, is what I'm saying. Before 1534, did he profess Trinitarianism?
That's a good question, but I don't know that either.
The problem is pre-existence. If Jesus pre-existed, did he have heavenly flesh before he became? That's beyond my realm. Seems to be an impossible question.
Well, I would just say this, the struggle within Anabaptism between David Joris and Menno Simons had to do with the fact that Bernard Rothman, who was the theologian for Munster, was a former Lutheran, and one of the first things he did before the polygamy, before the death penalty, was he affirmed Unitarianism. So we should know that for sure, all of us going into that Unitarianism was affirmed, and this was part of the reaction against it, so that the Anabaptists from 1534 forward really got closed off because of Munster and started going back. But that
Munster had a huge effect on most all the Reformation.
Yeah, but David Joris, even after that, was wanting to affirm Arianism, and it was Menno Simons who kind of won that power struggle. But his position wasn't orthodox either. So
No. Well, but I commend them as searchers, searching for truth. The Bereans were more noble than those in Thessalonica, in that they searched the Scriptures daily to see if those things were so. And that's exactly what we do, search the Scriptures. And there are things that we need to discuss.
Thanks, Ken.
Yeah. Doesn't sound like it's on, but
Anyway, you can hear me.
I can hear you.
So we got this Jude 3 passage, contend for the saints. I think that's your favorite verse.
Yes, it is.
It is, okay. I could have guessed that. All right. So, serious question here. I know you feel uneasy about how the faith is being contended for within the world, the conference, the general conference, the Abrahamic faith. Some people want to contend for it. Other people are content with not contending for it, and they're tolerating the consequences of that. You've navigated through this for many years. It looks like you're 60 years old, so.
Ooh, thank you. You're one of my favorites, Dustin.
Yeah. What is your advice as to how we move forward? How can we gently and respectfully contend for the faith, while we understand that there are other people around us that don't want to contend for the faith, and they're tolerating that mediocrity or that apathy? I mean,
My response is that has always been with us and will always be with us. However, having said that, I think the best counterbalance to that is a strong evangelism on the part of real believers. And we have lost that sense of evangelism. We should be planting new churches, we should be having Bible studies, and it just hasn't happened for years. In the conference to which I belong, the Northeast Conference, which is Ohio and Ontario, we were considering ourselves a church planting conference until I pointed out that the last church we really planted was 25 years ago. They just celebrated a quarter century. I don't consider that the way evangelism should be going, especially in light of the ages in which we live.
In your point of view, is there a connection between the disasters of the church history and the growing influence of the Islam in the world?
Yes, I think as the Christian church, however we want to define that, grows more and more unsure of who it is, Islam, which has a very strong opinion of what is able to overwhelm the church which doesn't know. That's my opinion. And I think it's going to get worse. In fact, it's interesting. I believe in gifts of the Spirit, though I am not a Pentecostal in the sense of speaking in tongues. But I received a prophecy from a friend that I value quite highly. And he's of the opinion that we're going to be experiencing disasters here in this land as well as Europe. And in just the very near future, he says. I don't know whether he's true or not, or whether he's correct, or if that is from the Lord or not, I don't know.
So one historical point, and if you look at this, check me on this. Menno Simons, as I understand it, excommunicated John Biddle on the issue of the Adam Pastor, sorry. Adam Pastor. So Mennonites are Trinitarians, theoretically. Adam Pastor was a Unitarian. That's an important point. Menno Simons excommunicated, actually, one of us. Shows the tragic divisions even within the Sicilian or the Anabaptist movement. Historical point, then. Coming back. Yeah.
Can I just say, Anthony, that, I mean, as early as 1527, Luther is trying to deride the Anabaptists by saying they believe that Jesus is a mere man, just like the Mohammeds, or just like Islam. So from very early point, the Magisterial Reformation understood the implications of Anabaptism was Unitarianism, and they wanted to say mere man, they wanted to say Islam, So it was pretty early on that they recognized where it was going to lead. And even if you read those stuff from early on, it was the Apostles' Creed, or the Old Roman symbol, was the ideal, and it was implicitly affirmed as Unitarian, not implicitly Trinitarian, as they try to say. So.
Okay, we'll take a half an hour. We'll be back at 3 for Faith Stories. And Jeremy Drake has some CDs he's selling at the back there. And the Hemp Hill book, if anyone has taken that or seen that, the children's book he was promoting. And also any registration, outstanding, see Robin at the back. And, oh yes, we have the raffles. There's only 12 names in that little box. These are for the New Testament translation and a special NRSV Bible Dictionary combo. So we're doing the drawing tonight at 7 p.m. So if anyone wants to put their name, and we're back at 3. Thank you.
Carlos, come unhook me, please.
And that one.
Oh, that's what. Yes, sir.